Welcome back, guys, to Within Tolerance Podcast, a podcast for machinists by a machinist. I'm your host, Dylan Jackson from Protean Machining, and this week I'm joined by John Russakoff from JSP Fab. So, welcome and thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
For anybody who doesn't follow you, or this is the first time we're having you on the program, let's kind of do a quick dive into your background and how you got to where you are now.
Well, JSP started as a business for me to be able to work on cars around 2008. I was heavily involved in sort of like motorsports and, working on cars for people. So I opened my own place, started taking work. And then after doing it for a bunch of years, started to get sort of burnt out on the working on cars thing. And we can get into it, but it eventually morphed into a CNC manufacturing business.
Yeah, and so for people who don't know your background, you started as, like you said, a kind of a racer. You were in Formula Drift. You've kind of done all of that as well, which is really cool. Like when I first found you on Instagram, I had no idea about that background, and then I think you posted something one day, and then I started noticing you. I was watching I think Chris Forsberg just had that recent like documentary on FD's YouTube channel, and I started seeing your Corolla in there and like your logo, and I was like, oh man, that is hilarious.
Yeah, it seems like a long time ago now, but it was definitely a really cool chapter of my life. I definitely don't regret it at all. It was a lot of fun.
So I guess what was your first machining job, or how did you first get into actual machining? Because you said you did fab work, fabs in your business name, but what was your first foray into like actually making chips?
So for me, as in the shop making chips, or just me personally, like being around machinery.
I guess you personally, and then we can go to eventually get to your shop.
So my first introduction to machining was around 2008 when I had first started my business, but I needed a regular job to supplement some income while I was starting up. And a friend of mine forwarded me to a local machine shop and said that I would be a good hire for him. And at that point, I didn't really have any machining experience at all, but I was down to go for the interview and go talk to the guy. And I walked in his office, and I basically explained to him that I didn't have any machining experience, but I was pretty handy and I was fast learning, and all of the things that are probably pretty good qualities when you're looking to hire. And so he walks me out into the shop, and I look around, and on the left side of the shop were two vertical Okumas, and on the right side of the shop were two gigantic horizontal Morisekis. And all the machines were running, spindles were turning, and there was parts laying all over the tables that looked really cool. Um, and and he ended up hiring me, and I started from nothing basically there, and sort of learned all the basics of tool setting and loading programs and proving out programs and small program edits and things like that. And it was just a really great place to start.
Awesome. And yeah, so for people who don't know what JSP Fab is, you guys make high performance automotive parts pretty much, and especially for the A86 Corolla, right?
Yeah, so it started out as just like a tuning shop originally, and I've always been really excited about the old classic Corollas. I've been building them since about 2002. I raced them professionally briefly, and so the shop was sort of just an extension of that, of the hobby. I was building cars for people, uh, and then from that, there was a small product line that we offered on our website, which was mostly fabricated components. Our engine swap kits back then were just like water jet steel plates welded together and things like that. But as we went along in the business, then it sort of morphed into a CNC manufacturing business, and it's a bit of an interesting story as well.
So if you have this whole professional racing side of your career too, which I think really informs your decisions on things like motor mounts and engine swaps, and so it really seems like it gives you a really nice niche in especially the A86 community.
Yeah, the A86 community is a super cool group of people. My If I go all the way back to when I started in cars, I started in the Honda Civic community when I was 16, and my first car was a CRX. And then I had a bunch of Civics, and then I got into the Rotary community and had quite a few RX-7s. But all the different groups of car owners that I've been associated with, the Corolla guys are just sort of like super down to earth, like never, like you'll never find them online fighting with each other. Customers are super appreciative when you manufacture parts for them because they know that it's such a small market. Whereas I think a lot of other markets, the customers can be a little bit more naggy, or maybe they don't appreciate the manufacturers as much as the Corolla guys do.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely seems like a cool community. I also found it funny. You sent me a kind of a brief overview of your career and your past shops and stuff, and it seemed like the common thread was that most of the shops you started in started out as primarily rotary shops and then transitioned away from them too, which was interesting.
That's true. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. But I think most it's difficult for rotary shops to sort of stay around. So it's pretty common for them to sort of take on other work. The rotary community is was definitely one of the most unique that I had been a part of. It's such a very strange market of customers because it's kind of like a like a black sheep vehicle that uh, is known to be, you know, fairly problematic and require a lot of maintenance. And so it's very common for all of those rotary shops to sort of have this, sales pitch of I can offer you reliability better than anybody else can, and that everybody else sucks. So it's sort of like a instead of like all of these rotary shops just showing everybody how awesome they are, they're really just all sort of bringing each other down, and it's sort of a really toxic environment. So that's one reason I'm not really into the rotary community anymore.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I mean, when you're dealing with a magic Dorito and you feed it money and it out comes Apex Seals, like
Yeah, I think the problem with that community is just that none of the shops are like super straightforward with their customers because they're really just trying to get they all they really want is they want you to bring the car to their shop so that they can dissect it. And then from that point on, they feel like the customer is tied to that shop because, you know, they've created that relationship. But it's just really not like that great of a business strategy in my eyes.
so like I guess let's kind of jump into your business. How I guess how did you start going from drifting to wanting to run a shop, and then what made you stop drifting and stop racing and go full time there? And let's just kind of talk through. You've had a lot of, I guess, major crossroads throughout your career, and let's kind of talk about each one of them and what made you go down the fork you did.
Well, the business was sort of started out of a necessity of just finding a way to be able to do my hobby and passion of cars. Because most nine to five jobs they don't really allow you that. They don't. It's not like a they don't give you the opportunity to bring your car in and work on it. Inside of their facility. So the only places that you can really do that in are like car performance places. And so those were most of the places that I worked at. And then the natural progression of that is to sort of get into your own place. And most of it is literally just to fuel the ability to go taking your car racing on the weekend. And at that point, you're just focused on making enough money to be able to do that. And then over doing that for multiple years, it just morphed into getting a little bit burned out and realizing that I would have to focus the business more towards parts manufacturing.
Gotcha. So I guess let's start first with like drifting. Was it the fact that all of these big sponsors were coming in and the cost of doing business, so to say, became astronomical, or what really started pushing you out of professional racing?
Um, I would say that the main reason that I stopped racing was because it did start getting much more expensive. And I did have like some sponsor money coming in that was helping to supplement for it, but it just felt like I was working really hard trying to keep up with all of these like racing teams on a really small budget, and it just seemed like it was never really going to be enough. And so the last year that I competed in 2011, um, I had pretty decent sponsor support financially, but I had to come out of my own pocket pretty heavily as well. And at the end of the year, I looked at a bunch of debt that I had created, and I went to all the sponsors and I said, "Hey, this is what it's going to cost for me to do next year. And if, we can't all come together and put that much money together, I just can't do it because it would be impossible for me to pay down the debt at the same time as forking out even more money to compete for another season. And so it just made much more sense to step away and put all of that time and effort that I was putting into racing into the business itself.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And so JSP started in the back of TurboSmart. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the shop that I was working at around 2008, which was the Rotary shop, it was a partnership, and the two guys sort of had a falling out, and the business was going to go under. And at the time, TurboSmart USA, which had just a couple years earlier just brought their office or added an office into the United States, was renting out of sort of the same unit as the shop that I was working in. So I had a working relationship with the owner already, and he knew what was going on, so he was already like planning to move into another unit in the complex. And when I talked to him about it, he basically said, you should just start your own thing. You should stop working for all these other people, and I'll rent you out the very back of the shop and you can figure it out from there. And so they put up a little wood partition in the back bay door of their shop. That was just basically probably a little bit smaller than a 2-car garage. I could squeeze 2 cars in, and then like a toolbox and a small table and stuff around the outside of it. But that was it. And that was the beginning of it. And, that there wasn't much to say back then except for, I would have customers come bring stuff to me, and I would feel a little bit uncomfortable about, oh no, don't go to the front, go to the back. Um, but it was cool to basically almost be forced into the opportunity of starting your own business, because I think a lot of people are not forced into it, and then it never happens for them. They want to do it, but because they're in a position where they're comfortable already, it's difficult for them to make that jump. Whereas I was kind of like at a crossroads, and I had to decide to either get another job or do something. And so it was a cool opportunity to be able to sort of get that nudge from Nick from TurboSmart into that position.
Yeah, as somebody who is currently comfortable in his job and making and trying to make this transition, I definitely feel that deeply. So it makes sense.
Yeah.
So Fort Manufacturing asked, what are the pros and cons of sharing shop space and how to structure a lease with multiple businesses? It sounds like there's definitely some cons, but what pros did you also have, and how did you guys structure that whole deal?
I mean, back then it was just a handshake. It was just, hey, get all your stuff out of that building and bring it over here to this building, and we'll figure it out. So we didn't have any, it would have been completely different if I didn't already have a friendship with them. If it was they were offering shop space for rent, then yes, of course, I would have had like a lease agreement and those things. But because it was just sort of a friend of mine helping me out at the time, it was just a handshake. And like I paid him, I don't know, I think I paid him like $500 a month or something for that back spot. Um, and I don't remember exactly how long I was there, but it was somewhere between 6 months to a year. I was in that spot before I moved into another unit by myself.
Oh yeah, so I mean, it sounds like it really got you off the ground because $500 sounds pretty cheap in California.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, relatively, it was probably about 300 square feet or something, 300 or 400 square feet. So it was probably a comparable rate that they were getting from me. But yeah, you're never going to find a 400 square foot unit, for rent anywhere to start. So yeah, it was definitely a fair opportunity. It was good.
That's great. So yeah, I guess let's talk about your next, I guess, big transition in the business was going from working on customer cars and doing fab work to machining. Like, how did you get there? How did you purchase your first CNC? What's the story there? How did you go from fab to now, CNC machine performance items?
So the quick recap is when I moved into my own unit out of that TurboSmart space, it was a 1,200 square foot unit, about a mile and a half away, which is sort of exactly where I'm at right now. I'm in the unit next to where I started. Um, and it started out me working on cars, and then I built up a decent clientele, small product line of fabricated components like headers and turbo manifolds that I sold on the website, and started getting more and more cars into the shop, and ended up even renting the shop next to my unit, pretty much just to store all of the customers' cars because there was so much stuff going on. And that went from 2009 all the way up until about 2000, I want to say like 14 ish. And it just got like super overwhelming, and I got really burnt out, and it was hard to keep up with all the work. And it just never seemed like I was going to ever make more than like an hourly wage, working on cars.
So what kind of work were you doing there? Where was it like engine swaps or roll cages, or what were you
Yeah, I
doing to
mean,
customer cars?
it was all that stuff. It was it started out as, whatever you wanted me to do, I would do it. And then it turned into you would just bring your car because you needed a part fabricated that wasn't commercially available. So a lot of the time people would come in and they would go, I bought this turbo manifold for my Corolla, but it was meant for an S2000. I need you to make all of the plumbing and the exhaust system or those things. And there was even, there was a time when we were even a Haltech dealer and distributor, and so I was doing like Haltech installs and some tuning and things like that. Um, and then towards the end, it was just pretty hardcore fabrication, so like roll cage and chassis work, pretty intricate engine swaps, but it was just like super labor intensive, and it was the paycheck was just sort of however much time you worked, and you got paid this much an hour, and it got real easy to get burnt out on that. And so around 2015, this is when right before Stacy and I got married, she was just like, "Yo, you got way too much on your plate. This is ridiculous. You need to get all the cars out of here. You need to downsize it back into one unit. You need to like get your shit together, basically." And so we spent about a year moving from the two shops into one shop, completing all of the customers' projects that we had, while at the same time not taking any new work. Um, and that transition was like, a pretty rough thing to say no to every single customer that you have lined up, especially when you typically don't have a shortage of people calling. Um, and then, you know, we got down to like two or three Corollas left, and it started to become more manageable. Um, and then one of the customers' cars that I was finishing, which was a '86 Corolla with a F20 swap, um, and he was um, he was an owner of a small firearms manufacturing business, and he also owns like a couple of gun stores and things like that. And so as I was finishing the project for him, he was just randomly talking to me about how one of his CNC machine suppliers, well, he was having trouble with them as far as like them meeting deadlines and having quality problems and things like that. Uh, and ironically, at the exact same time, the machine shop that I started working at contacted me and said, "Hey, I want to sell the business. Can you help me sell the business?" And so I began to help him do that as well. And this all turned into that customer pretty much saying, "If you buy one of those CNC machines, I'll give you this one job that I have, and it's a repeat job, and I'll pay you what I was paying the other machine shop." And so Stacy and I had to sit down and figure out if this was even something that was feasible. And it was at the time, the machine was basically like $30,000, and that was like an incredible amount of money to get a loan for, to pay for, and who knows if it was actually going to pan out and all of those things. And that was basically the step into us doing CNC manufacturing, was purchasing that first Akuma.
Wow. And that's not an Akuma you have anymore, but you do have another old Akuma, right?
Yeah, so that machine that I first bought was a 2001 MCV 4020, which is just their, mid-tier 40 by 20 machine. And the main reason that I bought it was just because it was the only machine that I had really, had my hands on, and so I was pretty familiar with it. When you're buying a CNC machine, um, the uncertainty of a new machine or a new control is sort of a turn off, I think. And because it was something that I already knew how to turn it on and set all the offsets and move it around, and I had already, cleaned it a million times, and I knew how to lubricate it, and I just sort of knew how it all worked. It seemed like it was a good fit, and not to mention it was 4 blocks away from my shop, so that made it a lot easier too.
Yeah, totally. Is that also the reason that you ended up, because you use Mastercam, right?
Yeah, so I mean, part of that business closing, that shop, the owner was using Mastercam, and he had a license with Mastercam, and he was like, "Well, what are you going to use for programming?" And I go, "Well, first of all, I didn't know how to do any, CAD design or CAM programming at the time. All I had ever done on those machines was, load programs into them and do some minor, G code program editing, and proving out programs and stuff. So I had no idea what I was doing, but he was basically saying like, I'll sell you my, programming laptop and my seat of Mastercam, for this amount of money if you want to purchase it, because the shop that I ended up selling the rest of the business to another shop, but they were already using a different cam system, so they weren't interested in purchasing the license from him. So I basically bought his laptop, uh, and it had Mastercam on it. I had like the legit dongle and all of those things. So as far as I know, it's legitimate. Um, and that's where I started with programming, is just an old version of Mastercam from my old boss.
Awesome. And you use that for design as well, right? Because you must be one of the only people I know that uses Mastercam CAD, like actually as CAD.
Yeah, so I've been told that it's incredibly cumbersome and difficult to use Mastercam for CAD. And in the very beginning, I would have 1,000,000% agreed, because the problem that I had in the beginning with Mastercam in the CAD side, is that it is incredibly not intuitive. And in that sense, it's very like a very cold software, where anytime you do something wrong, it just like makes a beeping noise, and just says no. But there's nothing that really explains like, this is what you're doing wrong and this is how to fix it. And so when you're learning how to do something, that can be like a really big hurdle. But after using it for a bunch of years, I kind of know all of the things that makes it beep at me, and then the things that it lets me do, and I can work around those constraints. But I'd love to move into something a little bit better for CAD design in the future, because I'm sort of at that point where I've reached the limitations of what I can do, and a lot of it just has to do with, you know, mm, mostly like fillets and molding surfaces, and anything that isn't just an angle, an edge, or a fillet, or a bore, or an extrusion, or all of those simple shapes. I have no problems doing, but the complex like push and pull stuff, it just has no ability of doing any of that stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, you do a fantastic job. Like I only realized recently that that's what you were using, and I was like, man, some of his parts are seriously complex for using. Because I went to school and only used Mastercam there, and so like I know all the Boolean operations you have to do for a lot of that stuff, or like the surfacing tools, and it's like it's not easy, and you make some really advanced, or much more advanced parts than I did in school, and like it was a pain then, so I can only imagine.
Yeah, the biggest pain is in the learning curve of Mastercam is the order of operation when you're constructing a solid. So there's a lot of things that once you get far along into the creation of the solid, where you can't do things unless you did something else prior. So I'm trying to think of some examples. Like, it doesn't like to put fillets around the edge of something that already has a chamfer, but it'll allow you to put a chamfer around something that already has a fillet, if that makes sense. Like, just
Right.
weird little things like that, where if you didn't know, you would go and you would chamfer your entire part, and then you'd go try to fillet something, and it would yell at you, and you wouldn't know why. You know, just
Oh
weird
yeah.
stuff like that. But it's like, once you learn all those little quirks, and you lose countless hours of work because you have to go backwards, then you start to understand the workflow of it. It's just like any software, I guess.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So back to your machines real quick. So you had this 2001 Akuma, and I'm looking at the list that you sent me of what you currently have. How did you get from there to where you currently are? Because now you've got older Akuma, but some brand new Haas's. What was the growth from there to here?
So going back to that 2000, I think we bought the first Akuma April 2016. We bought the machine and plopped it into the fabrication shop, and it was like, it's difficult to understand the learning curve, and then also the like purchasing curve of your first CNC machine, where you think that, what does the machine need? Oh, it needs electricity and it needs air. Okay, well, I've got a Home Depot air compressor and I have electricity, so this machine should work, right? And then you get the machine and you realize, oh crap, I need to buy tool holders, I need to buy tools, I got to purchase inserts, I have to buy coolant, I have to buy, lubrication for the machine. Um, and the expenses of getting it going are pretty extensive. And the first like year of ownership, it seems like every job that you have to buy every single tool for that job. And so that first year was like a crazy struggle just figuring that out. And there was a couple of times that the machine broke. And then realizing that going from one machine to zero machines is probably the worst scenario you can have. We decided that we needed to get a second machine after about a year. And so the second machine that we purchased was a 97 Akuma MX45, which is a similar construction as the MCV 4020, just a 3-axis vertical mill. The interesting thing about those Akumas is it's not like a standard C-frame construction like a Haas. The X-axis is completely supported for the full travel of the table, and then your Y and your Z are on the column. And so the construction of those two machines was the same. And so when I looked at them, I was like, oh, it's pretty much the same thing. I'll just buy that machine. The price was pretty reasonable. And so we added the second machine almost solely because we realized how much it sucked when one machine goes down, and your productivity basically comes to a complete halt. And so
Yeah,
that's why we
it's the
bought this.
worst feeling
Yeah,
for sure.
and that's why we bought the second Akuma, and it was something I was familiar with again, and I wanted to at least always have one machine. So that's why we got the second one.
Okay. And then how did you get your new Haas's? What was the decision there? Why Haas? Were you up to the limits as far as where you could go with your current Akumas? What made you buy a new machine, I guess?
So the second Akuma was purchased in 2017, and at the same time when I got the loan for that machine, the guy at the bank basically said, if you up your loan amount this much more, I can get you a much better interest rate, because it was I think the second machine was only like 17,000 or something, and he was like, if you break into the 20s, I can drop you like 1.5% or 2% on the interest, something that was significant. And so I had already been eyeballing lathes at that time. And just randomly in that week that I was purchasing the Akuma, a Miano lathe that I had been watching for over a year on eBay dropped from 12,000 to 8,000, and then again to $5,000 in the matter of a week. And I contacted the guy and I offered him 4,000, and he came back at 4,500 bucks. So when I got the second Akuma, I also tagged on this Miano lathe at the exact same time. So at the time that the second Akuma came, I had already received the Miano, so we were already up to 3 machines at that point.
Oh, so I got a third Miano fanboy on the podcast. Awesome.
Yeah, I have absolutely zero bad things to say about that machine. There has not been a single moment of ownership of that machine that it has done anything that I was upset about. It's been like the most bulletproof thing I've ever operated.
I mean, between you and Justin and Easton, it sounds like I might have to get a Miano eventually.
I,
Um,
it's like a crazy unique lathe because it fits a size that there's not a lot of other machines that fit into that size in like a turret style 2-axis lathe. When if they go smaller, they're usually like Swiss type, and they go larger, then they go much larger. I think that the X-axis travels only like 4 inches or something on that machine, which is like a really weird like size for small lathes.
so what do you use it mostly for? Is it for your shift knobs or?
Yeah, honestly, I had never operated a horizontal lathe, um, or programmed or set up a horizontal lathe before purchasing that machine. I solely bought it just because I wanted to learn how to do it. I don't remember if back then if I was outsourcing any lathe work on any of the parts that we are making, but I knew that I would for sure be able to incorporate something. And so I bought that lathe just as like a means of teaching myself how to program and operate a two-axis lathe so that we could later incorporate it into our products. Um, but yeah, it was actually a crazy story on that lathe because the eBay ad was just sort of like a faraway picture inside of a warehouse, and like the machine was like all tied up and you could barely even see it. And I think that's why they were having trouble selling it, because it was being sold by a broker. But when it arrived, it was like in almost new condition exterior, and I opened up the door and every tool holder had been removed out of the machine. The whole machine had been completely cleaned. They were all like all the tool holders were bubble wrapped and put into like nice boxes. It had every single instruction manual, every single floppy disk, that or did that machine have a floppy disk? Maybe not a floppy disk, but it had like every bit of documentation that would have come with the machine, including all of the operator's notes from whoever was operating the machine before they stopped using it. So it was
Wow.
like, so it also had programs in it. So I had like the most amazing resource for learning how to use that machine, because not only did I have like all of the FANUC books, but I had these handwritten notes by the operator explaining all of the can cycles and how to make adjustments and stuff. It was really cool.
That's amazing. That's a find of a lifetime for sure.
Yeah. And then the bonus part of it is I've got a good friend of mine, and he's the reason I bought a Miyano to start out, is he also has another Miyano lathe, is that these Miyanos have a parts counter on them, and as most like automated uh, lathes do. They are designed to make tons and tons of parts. I think my buddy's machine is at like 2 million parts or something. When I powered this machine on, it was at like 3,500 total parts since new.
Oh my goodness.
So
That is an amazing deal, man.
basically a brand new machine from
Wow.
1995. It was just like, holy crap, I can't believe it. But I'm sure that has something to do with why the machine's been so reliable and so good to me.
Yeah. So you had these three machines. How was the transition from doing fab work to getting up and running with a storefront, or an online storefront, and your product line? Like how were you advertising online? Like how did you get going with that side of the business?
Well, I think I was saying when we were doing fabrication stuff, I already did have a website, and I was already selling turbo manifolds and headers and some welded together engine mount kits. So we sort of already had a little bit of e-commerce going. And it was through web.com, which I don't recommend to anybody. Do not use them. Um, but it was sort of something already, so we already had people purchasing off the website, and so it wasn't like I had to go from nothing to something. It was just sort of improving that. And when we first started machining our own products, I had a couple of machined parts that I was outsourcing. I was having other companies make for us. And so that was, obviously the first things I started machining were all of those things. um, and then it just sort of continues from there. You try to add new products as you can, and then eventually you look back and you've got like 100 products or whatever. I don't know what it is we have now, but it's probably 70 products or something available. But it's just, it's hard to see how you get to 70, but it really just starts off as one.
Oh yeah, totally. So do a lot of your products come from personal things that because you have an A86 that you drive, you're sitting in it right now. So like do they come from personal needs and things that you've found in the past doing engine swaps, or are they customer demands, or is it a little bit of both, or how did you come up with your product line?
Yeah, originally we were just making stuff that wasn't available that people needed. So engine swaps on these cars were incredibly popular, from a decade ago until a couple of years ago, because the factory engine that comes in them is not that great. It comes with a 4AG engine, the same as the AW11, and it's a great engine for the 80s when it was created, but it just doesn't really keep up with modern performance. So we sold a bunch of swap kits for putting newer Honda engines, newer Toyota engines. We even had a kit for the Nissan SR20 engine for a while. So we basically just made those things because people wanted them. People wanted to make their Corollas faster. So we made the parts to help them make it faster. And then the other products that came after that were just supplements to those things. When you do an engine swap, there's always going to be some other little bracket or block off plate or something else that you're going to need as well. And so that's sort of how the product line started.
Okay. So as an aside, what's your favorite engine swap into an 80 AE86?
Favorite swap. That it's difficult to say only because I think that each one of those engine swaps serves like a different purpose. I think like if you don't care about what engine manufacturer you have in your car and you just want like a crazy fun car that's super reliable, then the S2000 engine is definitely the best engine. And I say that because the performance is like super good out of the factory engine, so it doesn't leave you wanting more power than what the stock engine offers. Um, and that makes the swap a lot easier because then you can do things like use the factory ECU, you can use the factory clutch, the factory transmission, the factory intake setup, or even the factory exhaust manifold. It allows you to sort of put like an all factory engine into the car. And then when you drive it, it feels like a very heavily modified car. And so I think that that's like the most straightforward way to get like a ton of really fun power in a Corolla.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. The F20C is an amazing motor. I mean, 100 horsepower per liter is tough to beat.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, it's super fun to drive.
what's in your car right now? A
So
4A?
yeah, so the car I have now is just a low comp 4AG, and that was on purpose because the last year or so we've been really pushing to develop more 4AG parts. The Corolla market has had a pretty heavy shift over the last 2 or 3 years to go from guys wanting to rip them apart and make them super fast to people wanting to do more of like a restoration or resto mod or just make it a little bit better but do more of a restoration. So it was natural for me to go buy another 4AG Corolla so that I can start developing products based around the stock engine, which I previously had not done very much of.
Okay. So, I guess in that vein, I've got a question. I see on your website and I've seen on your Instagram that you have billet valve covers. Let's kind of dive into the development of those because I have also designed ones when I don't know 4 or 5 years ago when I first like started going down this route.
Uh,
Um, and like I want to know, what did you use to reverse engineer them? How did you go about the design work on them? What goes into something like that?
Well, a couple of years ago, I bought an older Brown and Sharp CMM because I thought that it was going to be a great tool for reverse engineering components like those valve covers, for example. Um, but ironically, anytime I need to reverse engineer something that I can't just, pick up points on, say, like my surface plate with a height gauge, I actually just put it in the CNC and use an indicator to sweep holes and things like that because I'm much faster just manually jogging a CNC machine and finding locations and heights with an indicator than I am operating the CMM software. So when it comes to reverse engineering, I just sort of indicate a block or a cylinder head into the CNC machine, and then now with the Haas I can use the probe. But before I was just using just dial indicators and picking up all of the locations off of an origin point that I would set an origin somewhere that was relative that I could, um, position in CAM or in CAD, like a one singular hole and make sure that the cylinder head was oriented correctly and then just go pick up every other hole, and then I would be able to plot it that way. So
Oh,
it's,
wow.
it's kind of an interesting, way of reverse engineering, but I found it to be oddly way faster than the CMM software.
So the other question I had about your CMM is that the reflex box, like the little touch box thing that goes on the right hand side of your CMM?
No, I'm guessing on the age of the CMM, it's a micro valve, so it's like the older style one. So like the construction is the same as that reflex, but it's still using an older software,
Okay, so this is all PC based then.
PC based, yeah.
Oh, okay, okay, that makes
And
sense.
and so you've obviously used a bunch of different CMM softwares, right? I think you said that you had experience with it.
Yeah, well, I've got a either early 2000s or late 90s Brown and Sharp CMM as well, but mine's I
Yeah.
think the generation just after the microval.
Yeah, and those generations are stamped with a date on them, but the older generation machines have no date stamp. Kind of like a lot of like early 90s Japanese CNC machines, they've got a date plate, but nobody ever stamps a date in it. And it's funny because my Miano doesn't have a date either. And when I asked the Citizen guy when I had a friend of mine works for Citizen. He came to the shop to sort of check out the machine after I got it. And I was like, how come there's no date? And he was basically saying that sometimes the machines will sit for a couple of years before they're sold. And so they don't want to ever sell them as 2 years old. And so if they don't ever have a date on them, then they're just new.
Oh my goodness!
So, so I think that that's what Brown and Sharp was doing up until I think like yours, like in the late 90s. I think they started actually stamping dates on them.
Wow, that unfortunately makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So okay, so you've got these three machines now. You're starting to build a brand. Uh, it must be 2019 because your machines are 2019. When do you jump into a new machine, and what spurred on that decision to sell off one of your Akumas? I'm assuming you sold off the 2001 and bought your Haas's.
Yeah, so it was sort of a long time coming. I was a huge Akuma fanboy at the time when I had the Akumas. But through the couple of years of owning them, I slowly became less and less of an Akuma fanboy, based entirely around of their lack of support for their older machines and their sort of not very friendly service setup with Gossager that they have. Ordering parts from them is a nightmare on an older machine. Almost everything that you need for a 20-year-old machine is not in stock. They don't know when it's going to come. It's just a huge headache. And so after those machines needing significant repairs, the MX45 specifically, I've probably spent as much in repairs on that machine as I bought the machine for now. Um, and Akuma sort of being extremely unwilling to help me keep the machines going, uh, I was swayed over to the Haas machines by a couple of friends of mine that had Haas machines.
Okay, and then so you pick up both your VF2 at the same time as your mini mill, or
No, the idea was I needed, well, let me back it up again. So on the Akumas, these older machines, as anybody has an older Japanese machine knows, have absolutely zero memory. And Akuma does not offer any of the upgrades any longer. And on top of that, both of the machines did not have the ability to drip feed through the DNC port, and Akuma discontinued that option as well. So what ended up happening is I had started to learn how to use high speed machining, and all of my programs that I was writing were starting to get longer and longer, and it became literally impossible to make any of the parts that I wanted without breaking up, like I would have to break up an operation into like four programs to be able to complete one operation. And so it became such a constraint that we knew that we were going to have to buy another machine. I even had Akuma come to the shop and quote me on a Genos machine. I had a quote put together. I was, nearly going to pull the trigger on a 560 with a fourth. And then I think like the MX45 broke again. And I was like, oh, well, let me just take care of the repair on this. And then I just had another bad experience with repairing that. And that eventually led me to looking into the Haas. And then 2019, I pretty much knew exactly what I wanted. I basically wanted a 40 by 20 or a 30 by 16 machine that had as much memory as I could possibly need and a much faster spindle. And those were pretty much like my only requirements because at the time those were the only constraints that I had. And then, like always, Haas had a sale, and the VF2 SS was, I don't know, 10 or 15% off. And then you add a rotary to it. And I was just going to get that basic machine, and then after talking to Stacy about it for a while, we both agreed that it was like a buy one, buy once, cry once type of thing. And so I threw a bunch more options at it. I threw the probing in it and all the other stuff. Um, and then that machine arrived and it worked great. And then I think like a month after, Haas had this other crazy deal where they had like 25% off in stock machines. And the Super Mini Mill was one of the machines, and I think the base price on the Super Mini Mill was like 42 or 43,000, and so they had $10,000 off on it.
Oh my goodness.
And I was just like, oh God, I don't need another machine, but you know,
Yeah.
$10,000 off. I could always sell it for what I bought it for. So so we added the mini mill without actually like hardly. It was like a 1 day decision. Like I showed it to Stacy and she was just like, "So you're gonna get it, right?" And I was like, "Wait, what? You're totally on board?" You know? And so I called Haas and I was like, "I want this machine." He's like, "All right, I'll be over there. We could talk about it." And I was like, "No, I don't need like you to sell it to me. I just want to order it."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so it was like a one. Like I called the bank, they were like, "Sure, no problem." And it was like it literally in like 24 hours, the mini mill was taken care of, and then that showed up. So
So does that mean that the MX-45 is on its way out, or are you still using it in production?
yeah, the MX-45 just continues to break every 6 months or so. So it's broken now, and I haven't used it in probably 4 or 5 months. It needs, has something wrong with the spindle drive unit, and so I need to send that drive unit out to get repaired, and then probably just sell the machine.
So that actually gets into one of our listener questions. Cad Chris asked, once the old Akuma is gone and you move to a new shop, what's your next machine?
Yeah, so we're moving the shop. I think April next year, and our just like you, our shop only has 100 amps here, so that's been like a gigantic constraint for machinery. It's not even necessarily like the limited space because we obviously already have 4 machines in here, but we can only operate pretty much 2 machines at a time because of the 100 amp constraint. So as soon as we move into the new place that we got, it's got 400 amps, and so it's just like seems like an unfathomable amount of power. So we're definitely going to purchase probably, I would say, 2 more machines next year is probably on par, and I'm likely going to get another VF2. Probably the only option I wish I had gotten on the VF2 we have is just the extended Y travel. Um, so I'll probably get a VF2 YT. I don't know if I'll get the SS, but maybe an SSYT. And then the second machine purchase is completely opposite of each other, but it's either going to be like a VF3 or 4, um, just to be able to get more vices on the table for when I want to do like single piece flow and I want to have parts that are more than like 2 or 3 operations. If I could have like 4 vices on the machine, I could just walk the part through all 4 vices. I think that would be helpful. Or I've been looking at like the DT machines, or the DM machines as a replacement for the mini mill because I'm probably going to end up selling the mini mill also.
Okay. What's the thought process behind selling the mini mill?
Um, well, it's a machine that's sort of like 80% of what you want in a CNC machine. It's like it's got a lot of really great features for the price. I really like the size of it. It makes setup super easy. Like, um, the machine's got plenty of power. It's got really fast rapids. It's obviously got the Haas control and lots of memory, and so those are all great things. But the biggest issue that it has is a limited Z-axis travel, and then also the umbrella tool changer being in the machine while it has Z-axis limitations becomes a huge problem for running parts that are any more than say like I don't know 4 or 5 inches tall. And when you have to start, you know, manually hand programming your machine so that it can jog around one vise to go do a tool change in another position, that's frustrating. And then also, I think the machines were just sort of designed for like a low amount of material removal. And a lot of the stuff that I do, I try to get a lot of material off of it. And it just like with, like a high speed tool path, it's just like a roost of chips up into that umbrella tool changer. And it gets pretty problematic with things like chips on the tapers of the tools and things like that. And so I really just want to get another machine where the tool changer's out of the way and I don't have to worry about Z-axis clearance on moving around and stuff.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
But I mean, let's say I had a job that was specific and fit perfectly into the size of that machine and wasn't like a crazy amount of chips coming off. It would be a perfectly fine machine. I wouldn't get rid of it at all, but it just doesn't sort of fit with like the VF2 and the other parts that we make.
Yeah, I totally understand. And that kind of gets into another listener question from Z Mesner. So he asked, how do you keep up with the volume of such a wide variety of parts, and mostly, just you and your wife? Um, like, how do you manage your store so that you maintain stock levels at least on the stuff that you want to keep in stock, and how do you go about, introducing new product lines and keeping stock on those? How does that all work?
Yeah, I'm still working on that. I don't have a really great answer for that, but to give you an idea, so the when we first started manufacturing, like I said, I was doing some gun accessories for a customer, and that led into doing other job shop work for other companies. And up until maybe the end of last year, the majority, like heavily, the majority of the money that we made through machining was through job shop work. It wasn't through our own products. So I was not that focused on new products and inventory and those things. Um, and then the end of last year, we decided that we really wanted to shift away from that because, as you know, you're a job shop. The job shop stuff is sort of great in the sense that people just send you something and you make it, so you don't have to have the liability of like designing and producing your own product. But at the same time, you also have to deal with them in the sense that they want to pay on their own terms. They might be critical of your components, or they might be difficult to work with, or the things that they give you are much more difficult than you feel comfortable doing sometimes. Things like that. It just can be like, a little bit more stressful in other ways. And so we were pretty on board with just saying, well, we've been doing the job shop thing for a bunch of years. We're now relatively competent in being able to machine our own components. And the job shop stuff was really helpful in sort of giving me like a crash course in engineering, like understanding all of the prints and working with the engineers and how they develop their products and things like that. That we were like, okay, let's just apply it to our stuff and let's pump up our product line. And so, the end of last year, we released a bunch of new stuff for Black Friday. And since then, our our sales, or like let's say like the gross sales of the business, went from probably like a 70-30 majority job shop gross to now we're pretty much flipped to where our own products are like the heavy majority in the work that we do. um, and it's been like a real struggle, as the question says, to sort of have a balance between uh, not overstocking a product, spending too much money on inventory, and then also the other side is running out of the product all the time. So it's been something that we've had to learn, and especially because of like the pandemic and COVID, the car parts sales, I think for even all of my friends that do the same type of thing, it's just been crazy. Like everybody that's been home has just been working on their cars. So the sales our product sales this year were more than we expected. So we've been trying to balance our quantities of our inventory to sort of reflect that. And so what we do is each time we go to restock something, we look back and go, oh, well, that wasn't enough. So let's double or triple it, you know, and that's what we've been doing. And then now we got to Black Friday this year. We had about 3 to 4x on our standard inventory, and the Black Friday sale went better than expected, even. And now we're out of everything again. And I'm sort of scrambling to meet minimum orders just to fulfill for our customers right now, and then we'll get back to it again in January on all of our restocking and new products. I actually had two other new products that we were supposed to release this year in just December. That's just not going to happen.
Wow, that's fantastic to hear, though. So how do you go about creating your first run? Like, what informs you on how much you should make or how much you should make for like a Black Friday sale? Are you just shot in the dark, or based on other products that are similar that you've sold in the past? Like, what starts that quantity?
Well, this kind of goes back to like the Corolla community in general, and the Corolla community is very active in the sense that like when I make a post about a new product, whether it be on Instagram on our page or even in like different Facebook groups and things, it's very easy to gauge feedback on a new product when you are going through the design and the prototype process. So very rarely am I surprised by the sales that come on a first batch of parts. And so I would say you can get a pretty good grasp of what the demand's going to be like before you start there, and then just make, say, like 30 to 50% more than what you think you're going to need for that first release. And that first release of products usually is just going to cover the cost of the time that you spent to develop the product and stock that first batch of orders. So that's really all you're trying to do is just pay for all of that so that once that's sold out, now it's all of the programs are written, the parts proven out, and it's much less expensive to produce the second batch, which you can go in and up the quantity on.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So is that like how, like, for example, you released your new shift knobs with the wrinkle finish? Do you use like Instagram polls, or are there any tools on these social media platforms that you use besides just posting about it?
So shift knobs are a unique product for us because we've released a like new style of shift knob every year for I think the last 4 years, and it's always at Black Friday. And we typically don't release new shift knobs throughout the year, and it's one of the things that I don't really rely on customer feedback on, uh, because if I on something that's like a shift knob, it's very personal, and you're going to get like 10 million different ideas from customers on what they think is cool or what they want to buy. And if you put it out there, you're just going to sort of be confused about what it is that you need to make on a cosmetic item like that. So what I do is I just try to improve on the design in a way that I like, or from the feedback that I've heard throughout the year from the customers that purchased the last version. And I'll just try to apply that. Um, and then when it comes down to colors, it's that's more of where like the feedback of the customers come in. The design part of it is usually just my own, um, but it's very clear to see just through sales, which colors people like and which colors people don't like. And we just sort of try to follow that, plus usually one or two sort of off the wall or unusual colors.
Yeah, that makes sense. So going into this whole creating products thing, Built by Hutch also asked, would you recommend creating like a broad selection of products or finding a small niche market? And it sounds like you've kind of done a little bit of both, but do you have any advice for him in that aspect?
Um, what I would have said maybe like a year ago when we were starting to ramp up our products is that you want to find a product that a million people want it and then just make it. But after going through this year of constantly running out of products and fulfilling orders, I think that maybe that's probably not the best plan. Probably the best plan is to start a little bit simpler and smaller and then just build the business in a way that is scalable and you can figure out all of the different processes it's going to take to sort of escalate production. And also like the fulfillment side of it is like much more of a hassle than you think it's going to be in the beginning, where if you think that you can ship a couple of orders a day, that's totally doable. But when all of a sudden it becomes like, you know, a gross number larger than a couple orders a day, you realize that all of a sudden becomes a huge time suck from doing other things. Um, so it's better, I think, to sort of slowly build up all of those different processes. And the best way to do that is sort of start small, start on a small scale.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what do you guys use for fulfillment? Like, I assume it's either you or Stacy that's packing all the orders. So do you have any shortcuts or tricks that you find makes the shipping process easier?
Yeah, our store we use Shopify for our store, and they've got a lot of cool like adaptations and plugins for different shipping and label printing stuff. So we do all of our shipping through Pirate Ship, which is a USPS provider, and it links directly with Shopify. So Shopify gives the customers the option of different shipping options, and then they select it. It automatically goes into Pirate Ship, so we get the shipping label through Pirate Ship that's already produced. And then fulfillment is done also back through Shopify after the shipping label is created. The only thing that we're really doing manually now is just our invoicing internally through QuickBooks.
Okay, awesome. So another question that Built by Hutch had was, do you find the automotive community hard to sell to, or he also sells to the Miata community. He
Mm-hmm.
makes little GoPro mounts and things like that. And he says it seems like everybody wants something different and made perfect for dirt cheap. But it sounds like you said earlier that you really like the Corolla community.
Yeah. So one thing that I've definitely come to appreciate over the last couple of years is that the customers will pay what something is worth, and they are apprehensive to pay more than what something is worth. And that's based on their perception of value, not on the perception of value of the person that's making it, if that makes sense. So if you create a product that you think is super awesome and it costs you a bunch of money to make and you want to sell it for $400, but either the customer thinks it's only worth 150 or you haven't justified the cost to your customer, then it's going to be difficult to sell it for 400 bucks. So the best thing that you can do is try to get a good grasp on your customer base and find ways to create a product that is worth more than what you're selling it for, if that makes sense. And that can be like humbling and difficult in a way. But for example, when we used to sell our welded together engine mount kits, they were water jet steel components that I MIG welded together and had them powder coated. And our cost to manufacture on that, if you include the time, was relatively low. And then we started, machining all of our engine mount kits from billet, and it takes much longer to make. The material cost is much higher, but the finished product I think is much nicer. And initially, when we released them, we were selling them for the same price as the steel kits.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So we basically took a hit on our profit margin on our engine mount kits because we wanted the customers to basically feel like what they were getting was a great deal. It was worth more than what they were paying. So I think when you're growing a brand, it's much more important to gain the trust of the customer, so that they can feel like you're not trying to take advantage of them, or just in a sense that they're getting what they're paying for. Because it's real easy in the performance aftermarket industry to feel like you're paying more than what you're getting for a lot of things.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So on the flip side of that, has there ever been a product you've released that you've later pulled down or had to drastically mark down that you overvalued?
Yeah, probably our valve covers. I think
Okay.
that those were overpriced, but I think a lot of it had to do with, at the time of release, it was a big project to take on. And that was another one of those things where I started making them in the Akuma. And because of all the surfacing, it was literally three separate programs on each side of the valve cover. And it was just like extremely tedious. And that goes back to me saying, like, how I was saying that to me, it was much more valuable than what it would be to the customer, because they don't see that side of it. They don't see the side of how much time it takes to make something. And so as the manufacturer, my job now is to, instead of trying to pass on that stress of making the product onto the customer, I need to find ways to reduce those stresses and make my parts cheaper and faster and better so that the customer can pay less, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, it totally does. And I deeply feel the whole loading multiple programs and all of that. Our Kitamura only had 512 of memory, and for any of our listeners, or if you've seen our Cam Challenge, one that won the Autodesk Cam Challenge a couple years ago, I had all of these 3D machined Autodesk logos, and I think each one of them took two or three different loads into the control, and I probably had almost as much time just loading programs into that thing as
Yeah.
I did actually machining it, and it was that was one big thing buying the brother. It's like I loaded a 5 megabyte program the other day in a blink of an eye, and it's like, man, that would have taken literally 5 hours to load into the Kitamura if I had the room.
Yeah. So my MCV was able to run a program that was 32K. That was the largest program.
Oh,
And the MX45 can only run a 16K program.
oh my goodness.
And so, I guess one thing that taught me was how to use all the filters in Mastercam for the post processor, because I would spend sometimes like an hour plus going through a program of trying to filter, going through the smoothing and making sure that any line segments were written as, um, as radiuses in the program instead of broken line segments, to try to shrink the programs as much as possible. It was such an incredibly tedious process. Unless like you can understand it because you're sort of in the same boat, but it's so hard to explain that to other people that just put their program on a USB and plug it in their machine and push start.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The first shop I worked at had a few kilometers that were I think 32K memory as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's tough. Like you'll spend 45 minutes just trying to get it loaded on the machine, and then you finally have to break off one tool or two tools, and it's just yeah, it when all you want to do is make chips, having to spend that time is so incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, that was probably the biggest reason for buying a new machine. I would say was, besides really wanting to have something that was reliable and like a higher RPM spindle, and those are all great, but just the time saved from just like post process to in the machine has been almost invaluable.
Oh yeah, I think we save 5 to 10 hours a week because like the worst thing too is I mean for me I had more memory than you did, so like I would load a 300K program that would take 8 minutes to load into the machine, and I'd run one toolpath and realize, oh, I made a mistake and I need to change it and I need to repost it, and it's like, oh, there's another 8 minutes down the drain. So it's yeah, it's the little things like that that you never really realize how much money you're losing until you're doing it every day, and then it's way too much, way too much.
Yeah, and then there's the other side of it too. Like, let's say you're doing a surfacing program or a surfacing toolpath, and the surfacing toolpath is too long. How do you make it shorter? Well, you have to increase your step over, right? So then your surface finish goes to shit. So you're like sacrificing the quality of your products based on the memory size of your machine. It's like a lose lose.
Oh yeah, 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 I could go on forever about this because it has burned me so much and it hurts so deep that um,
I'm glad that I can have somebody that I can share this with,
oh yeah,
because literally everybody else in the world that I've talked to is like, "Oh, well, I've got at least a megabyte," and I go, "Oh my god."
yeah, it's nice starting from that because you really do appreciate the little stuff like that. But man, it's rough. Like it really I and we my last episode with Joe, we talked about buying used machinery, and I failed to say anything about that. So if you're listening to this one and you just listened to the last one, I still think you could buy old machinery, but make sure you have at least a half a meg or something like that because it really, I mean, especially with modern cam systems and like adaptive clearing or Mastercam's high speed machining plus all of the 3D stuff, programs get really big even with arc filtering and all of those filters. So
Yeah, I would go so far as to say don't buy an older machine that doesn't have a drip feeding option.
yeah, oh, that's a good one too because yeah, our TC brother, it can only hold a 90K program, but I can drip feed off a USB, so at least I can run a big program if I need to.
That's sort of like the work around the tiny memory in the old machines.
Yeah, yeah, it's still a little sketchy, but I'd rather a little sketchy than frustrating every single day for the rest of my life.
And then talking about the first machine purchases, the other thing that I would do if I was buying my first machine again is I would contact local to you, whoever you would be hiring to do the repairs, and get a feel for how easy they are to deal with. Because that's like a huge part of it when you have an older machine, that you don't think about necessarily up front.
Yeah, yeah, because you will need them. Older machines will require some repairs here and there, so you want to make sure you have a good support. So the last question Rob had was an A86 is one of his most affordable dream cars, but he's never driven one. What makes you like them so much?
Um, Without going into too much like Toyota history, the A86 is the last rear wheel drive Toyota Corolla. And so it's like the culmination of all of the different things that Toyota learned through the E chassis Corolla from 1966 all the way until 1987, it being the last iteration, just like anything, is sort of like they took everything that they learned and they put it all together. And so the A86 is extremely lightweight in comparison to most other cars. It's about 2,200 pounds. From the factory, the GTS model comes with the 4AG engine, which is a twin cam 1.6 liter that it's not fast, but it's enough to get the car going. It has a 4-link live axle rear. It's got 4-wheel disc brakes. It's got a relatively precise steering rack setup. It has a good steering feel. That's not, if you use the manual steering, not too heavy, not too light. I would say the things that it does best are it gives incredible feedback to the driver that makes you not question the things that you're doing while you're driving. Like, you know that if you turn the wheel this way, the car is going to go that way. Or if you know you push the brake pedal this hard, the car is going to stop this much. Or, you know, it's a very analog car that has some of the newer features that a lot of the old analog cars didn't have. So it basically has the combination of being extra lightweight, small wheelbase, which makes it sort of fun and agile. But then it also has things like it's got good brakes on it. A lot of them came with a factory limited slip differential. The engine has a decent amount of power. The transmission is, not amazing, but definitely fun to drive. It's sort of just like, a really fun car that doesn't ever really surprise you. It just does everything that you want it to do. So it becomes really easy to connect with the car.
Yeah, I've my car is half of what you have, more or less. I mean, the front half it looks like an A86 and same engine and everything, and I couldn't agree more. Like the 4A might not be 200 or 300 horsepower, but it does rev to like almost 8K, and it's a ton of fun.
Yeah, I think the AW11 probably has a somewhat similar like feel. The AW11 steering rack is almost identical to the A86 steering rack, so the steering ratio is very similar too.
Yeah, I really love these older Toyotas. And actually, the A86 rack. So I had a first gen Celica years ago that I was going to build up, and I had bought a steering rack from an A86 to put in there because everybody spoke so highly of it. So it even trickles down to older cars.
Yeah, yeah. That goes into what I was saying about the 86 being like the last iteration. That, the generation before the A86, only some of them were steering that had steering racks, some of them still had steering boxes. Um, and so it being the last iteration of the Corolla that's rear wheel drive just sort of got all of the stuff that makes it reliable and fun.
Totally, I couldn't agree more. It is a it's super cliche to say, but it is like a fantastic driver's car. Like you have amazing connection. It's not too much power to like kill yourself, but it's super fun on street roads and stuff like that, and on the track. And it's just a cool car.
So when are you going to get one?
Oh, eventually, I'm sure. I'm sure I'll end up with one. I want another first gen Celica. I want a A86. There's a lot of older Toyotas that I want. And you had a Mark III Supra too, right?
Mark IV.
Or Mark IV. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Yeah, I've had quite a few cars.
yeah. Well, and you've had the big ones from Toyota too. Like that's for a lot of people, their dream car is a Mark IV. So that's pretty
Yeah,
neat.
I've owned two first generation Corollas, a 69 and a 70. I've owned two second generation Corollas, a 71, and I currently have a 73. And then I've probably owned about a dozen A86s, and then the Mark IV Supra. And I've had an SW20 Turbo. I think that's pretty much it for like the Toyota fleet.
That's pretty good though.
Yeah.
Well, and your Supra had HRE wheels. Was that while you were working there?
Uh, yes. So before I worked at HRE, I had friends that worked at HRE. And so the first set of HRE wheels that was on my Supra was a set of wheels that I had made before I worked there. And then the second set of wheels that I had made, the ones that look kind of like the Lamborghini wheels, those I actually made while I worked there. And so that one was cool because I actually got to machine those wheels myself. And so that was the
That's
first time I ever made a wheel for myself.
yeah, that's pretty epic. I mean, of all places to machine a wheel too, HRE is like pretty high up there.
Have you ever been to HRE?
No, I haven't.
It's about a block from my shop right now. It's a super cool facility. They do an open house every year. I would go on a limb and say it's worth the drive from where you're at to come see it.
Okay. Wow. Well, so Brad and I have this grand plan of kind of doing a machining tour of California at some point here. I mean, whenever all this blows over, but like we want to go see Orange Vice and DMG and stop by all of our Instagram friends shops and all that stuff. So we'll have to plan all that out and make sure that we add that to the list as well.
Yeah, they're usually super friendly about giving tours and stuff too, but you just got to give them a heads up. And if you guys want to check it out, I'm still close with all the guys that work there, so it wouldn't be difficult to get you sort of in all of the machine shop to check it out.
Oh man. Well, I will definitely let you know when we're coming out because we will want to do that. So let's talk about your time there. I mean, this is kind of a reverse 180 from where we were. We were here modern day, but you worked at HRE. How was that, and what lessons did you pick up from there? Because they clearly know what they're doing as far as making wheels. And in the notes you had sent me, it sounds like they had some interesting ways to make sure that they could make wheels on the fly really quickly.
Yeah, they're a very unique wheel manufacturer in the sense that they don't do any wheel production in the sense that they don't have any inventory at all, which is unusual for a wheel manufacturer to not have any inventory. So every single HRE three piece or one piece forged wheel is made to order. And on top of that, they can turn them around in probably about 3 to 4 weeks total lead time, which even for like some wheel companies that have wheels in stock is really fast. But the way that they operate is a sales order is created, and then that sales order goes into their programming department. And then the programming department figures out which program is going to be needed to make each one of those wheels. And all of the information that the operator is going to need is basically put on the ticket that or the traveler that goes with the wheel order. And then all the wheel orders are placed at the beginning of the production. And the jobs, it's a little bit different now, but when I worked there, the jobs were just sort of distributed in two fashions because it's a different production line for their three-piece wheels than it is for their single-piece wheels. And primarily, I think I did mostly three-piece stuff. So they would first divide it by three-piece and one-piece, and then each one of their vertical machines that do the three-piece wheels were separated by wheel diameter size. So if it was a 17 or 18 inch, it would go into one machine. If it was a 19 or 20, it would go in another machine. And then 21 to 24 or whatever go in another machine. And that was solely because of the work holding that was in the machine had multiple step sizes on the soft jaws to hold those different wheel faces. And so they would divide the workload in that way. So like let's say you're on the 18-inch machine, you would get your work order. It would tell you a forging number, which sometimes you would have to get the forgings, but a lot of times they would have guys that would stage all of the forgings by the machines that they would go to. So you would have all your forgings ready. You would go over the work order, and it would give you the information like the wheel style, which would be a program number, and then the PCD style or the lug style, plus the bolt pattern, plus the back wheel hub bore diameter, which was machined individually for every single vehicle that was purchased for, and then also whatever center cap style you wanted. And as I'm sure you know, if you had to do this for an entire wheel line, it would basically be a huge list of different programs for every possible configuration. But they were smart enough to put together a basic uh, program that used all of the macro variables. And so the operator would just input each one of these values, which it would either be like a numerical value 1 through 5, or it would be a value that was like a word like Porsche or Toyota or something like that. And they would enter it into the macro variables. They would call up the program that was needed. They would put the forging into the machine and they would hit cycle start. and all of the machines had the same tools in them. All of the wheels were machined using the same tools. And there was pretty much nothing else that the operator had to do, except after the wheel face came out, they would just have to inspect it. They'd have to measure the hub bore to make sure it was correct. They'd have to make sure it was the correct depth on the lug nut seating area, and it had the correct center cap size. And then they would just move on to the next one. So it sort of took like all of the fears that everybody that runs a job shop and wants to hire somebody to operate their machines for them. They basically took all of the thinking out of the job shop side of it and turned it into production, which was like, I'm sure it was a huge feat. And they did it before I started working there, but it was like almost flawless how well it worked.
Wow, that's impressive. That is really really cool. And then you had said that now they do it all with pallet pools and things like that.
So now they used to have two large horizontal lathes that machined the front side and back side of the forgings for the three-piece wheels, and then it would go into their big Haas vertical mills for the three-piece. Now they don't even use those anymore. They've got I think 4 or 6 vertical lathes that do the turning from a rough forging to just a finished turn profile. They use those machines for both the three-piece and the one-piece. And then now, um, I think like a large majority of their wheels are now just loaded into their pallet pool setup for their horizontal mills, and I think it's something like a hundred different pallets or something like that. And they're like these are gigantic tombstones. It's a huge operation, and so the operator now inputs like a program work order number with the wheel as they load it into that pallet. And inside the office, they've already assigned all of those macro variables to that work order number so that the operator, all that they can mess up now is by putting the wrong wheel in with the work order.
Wow, that is a dialed process. How cool.
Yeah. And so they run, I'm, I know the engineer there pretty well. And I think the last time I talked to him, he was saying that they can run for about 48 hours straight on a set of pallet, on a loaded up pallet pool. So they used to run 2 shifts 7 days a week, and now I think they no longer have a night shift, and they don't work on the weekends. So they basically like load up on a Friday, and then they come back on a Monday, and like 100 wheels are made or something.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that is the dream right there. That's amazing.
So it's a pretty awesome setup if you come out to look at it.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to make our way out there. I know there's so many motorsports and machining things out there that we want to see that we're just gonna have to figure out how to plan it all together. Because like I'd love to come out for the Long Beach FD round as well, and there's just a ton out there that I want to see. So we'll do it for sure.
Yeah. SoCal's the place.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not right now. It's not, but maybe next year it will be again.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So another couple questions we have, and then I want to get into shop stuff too. Windmill Motorsports asked, "What are common parts made in the drift car world?" And actually, I guess that kind of brings up another question: what made you not want to go into drift parts? Because it seems like most of yours are street focused.
I would say a lot of it has to do with really sort of staying in a niche. When I first started making stuff, it was like I said, engine swap kits and turbo manifolds and headers, and those were all things that nobody else was making. And currently, there's already quite a few companies that make like suspension components and arms and links and steering stuff and whatnot to make Corolla sort of drift and handle better. And without some like really extreme innovation, it would be difficult for me to justify spending a bunch of money to release a product that somebody else already sells. Um, but I guess it is possible to move into it eventually, but I just don't see it as something that's super appealing to go out and do the same thing that other people are doing.
That makes sense. Do you miss drifting? Like, is there a part of you that would love to go into drift products just so you had a reason to do some R&D?
Well, I mean, drift products is a very unique way to call them because you can go drift a stock car, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So drift products, maybe what they're saying is more things like hydraulic e-brake type of setups, or upgraded transmissions, or
Angle kits or
drifting
something like
now.
that.
Yeah, drifting now is a lot different than it was 10 or 15 years ago where people were modifying their regular cars to go drifting. Most drift cars now are some sort of an adaptation of like a NASCAR or like in some sort of like competition race car adapted onto another chassis. It's very rare that you'll go and you'll see like a Nissan 370Z and be like, oh, it still has the stock engine, the stock transmission, the stock rear end. It's the only thing that's stock on the car is like maybe just the unibody, and everything else is something else from NASCAR or something else on it. So like drift parts, when it comes to Corollas, I don't think Corollas are ever going to go to that point again where people are just turning a majority of them into race cars. So I don't think it's necessarily someplace I would go with them.
That makes sense. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you watch any FD round, and it's like every single car has 950 horsepower plus, and it's definitely not a stock engine or even close to the stock engine that was in the car. So it makes sense totally.
Yeah, like I want to say probably 99% of the Formula Drift field is using like a NASCAR dog boxes. Probably 70% of the field is using some sort of like either Ford or Chevy based aluminum V8. And then the same percentage is using like a sprint car or NASCAR style quick change rear end. So like almost the entire drivetrain is domestic in those cars.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that answers another question. I can't find it right now, but somebody had asked if you would make a 4A to a GSR adapter, and like,
I I don't even know if a 4AG could turn a GSR transmission. Like the internals of a GSR transmission are like I don't know, probably 3 times the mass of a T50.
yeah.
Like to give you an example, so my drag car was a turbocharged F20, and originally it had the S2000 transmission, and the rear end was a 7.5-inch Toyota rear end, and um, the last time that I dynoed it in that configuration, it was making something like um, I want to say around 700 horsepower or something like that.
Oh wow.
Like maybe like high sixes or something, and that was definitely the limit of all of those components for sure. And then I ended up swapping out for a G-Force 4-speed, and then I put a strange 9-inch in it, and just adding the transmission and the 9-inch rear end dropped about 80 horsepower off of the wheel horsepower.
That is a
So it
ton of
took about
loss.
80, yeah, like 80 more horsepower to turn those bigger, heavier components. So it's
Wow.
that's something that some people don't think about, when they're upgrading the drivetrain on their car is that, you're spinning heavier stuff. And a lot of times those components being larger, they have a much more like, they have much more friction when rotating, more contact, more surface area that's contacting. So it sort of drags as it's spinning.
Yeah, I mean that totally makes sense. I mean, what the quoted number is what normally 15% driveline loss, and like I'm sure that the more you add stuff like that, the more that number just keeps spiking up and up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 9-inch rear end was like the big killer. Like it was an effort to even just rotate the pinion shaft by hand on that rear end. Everything was super heavy on it.
Oh, that's crazy. So, and actually, a question had come in over Instagram from Windmill Motorsports also while we were talking, and he asked, when you were drifting, did you ever feel bad about running off the track and destroying the ground? And he asked because he is part of a motorcycle racing team, and so they fall and get launched and drag stuff and all that stuff. So
I mean, in the moment when you crash your car or go off course, you're definitely not thinking about the course, and the guy that owns the racetrack. That's for sure. You're not thinking about that. But there's definitely plenty of venues that have stopped accepting drifting because of stuff like that. Um, and for the most part, when I was sort of drifting a lot, they were at tracks that accepted it, and so they knew it was going to happen. And they a lot of times would have precautions set up for instead of going off into the dirt, they would just put a wall with tires so that you wouldn't damage their track. You would just destroy your car. And a lot of those tracks would also say like you can drift corners 1 through 7, but you can't 8 through 12 because of possibility of damaging the track. Those types of things. So I think towards the end, the organizers were pretty aware of the damage that the cars could cause, and they did whatever they could to sort of mitigate that.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Oh, and so actually, this question, speaking of drifting, you just kind of brought it up. Where were you in the whole transition? Because like drifting FD initially was like very much high speed leaning, and then it all of a sudden started moving towards proximity. Like, were you in the middle of that, or were you just before or after that? Like,
So the proximity thing is actually relatively recent over the last couple of years. And before that, it was definitely a race for speed. So the very beginning of drifting, when I started getting into it in like 2003 or 4 ish, um, it was just sort of about like having like a really cool style. So like if you had a lot of angle, a lot of tire smoke, close to a wall or a cone, those were the things that everybody would score highly on. And then uh, people started realizing that instead of just having style, they also wanted to win because there started to be money in it. And then the easiest way to win would be to when you're leading to just pull away from the car that's following so that they don't have an active chase following you and you basically automatically win. So over those next couple of years, all the cars were focused mostly on like forward bite and forward grip from acceleration from start. And that sort of got rid of a lot of the high angle, high style that was in drifting. And then the next transition was the 1,000 horsepower race, where every car started to have 1,000 horsepower. And then that sort of brought the tire smoke and more angle back in with the high speed. And then now that all the cars are just as fast as each other, they started making the rules for proximity to make it more exciting for everybody. So I would say I was probably, when I was really competitive, it was in that like ramping up stage of cars trying to get faster and faster and faster just so that they could pull away from each other and win the race.
okay. So what kind of horsepower were you running? I guess your last couple years in competition.
Um, so the in the start, it was still just a 4AG naturally aspirated, about 150 horsepower. Then a naturally aspirated F22, and then a turbocharged F22 that was about 350 to 400 horsepower. That was probably till about 2008. And then 2009 and 10, the car probably had about 450 to 480. And then 2011, it had about 550 to 580. That was the most that I saw in the car. But it was it was a lot different back then in the sense that the car only weighed 2150 to 2200 pounds, whereas every FD car now is over 3000 pounds. So the power to weight was really good back then. So I was able to keep up with cars that were maybe say like 700 horsepower or something, 700, 800.
Jeez, yeah, 500 horsepower at 2,100 pounds sounds frightening. I'm just thinking of like my car with 500 wheel would be a death trap. So,
Yeah, it's in a sense, it's almost like Formula Drift had to start shortening the runways up to the first corner because the cars started getting so fast that they would have to decelerate before the entry of the first corner, otherwise they would overshoot it. So it was like a learning curve even for Formula Drift when designing courses. Now, if you look at all the starts of all of the tracks, there's like, I don't know, like a 50 yards or something before the first corner, and they're already at full speed. So it was definitely an interesting time where when I first started in Formula Drift and had 200 horsepower, I would be floored from the very beginning, and it would just be like rowing through the gears till I would clutch kick at like 80 miles an hour or something. But then towards the end, like you would hit 80 miles an hour halfway to the first corner, and then you're like, well, now like do I just go 120 or 130 into the corner? And so there was actually a lot of accidents and crashes in that learning period of those entries because the entry speeds got so high.
yeah, I bet. I mean, that's one thing that is very interesting about FD is it is like such a young sport that there is active changes almost every year, it seems like. I mean, a lot of these, NASCAR's been going on forever. And so like the format is more or less the same until they start introducing new cars. But like FD, it seems like yearly they change the way that they're scoring or the way that they're setting up courses or something like that.
Yeah, my only gripe with FD, and I think that the guys that run it are they're doing it correctly, but the problem is what they're trying to do is make a show, that runs consistently and smoothly. And the only way to do that is to basically have all of the cars perform very closely to each other, so there's not a huge discrepancy between the cars, because that usually causes either accidents or not very exciting drifting. And so they've created rules that have sort of phased out any cars that don't fit into this mold that they've created of the 3,000 pound, 295 tire, 1,000 horsepower, medium wheelbase car that every car in FD is.
Yeah, yeah, I can definitely see that, and I think that there's a lot of validity to that, for sure.
But yeah, what they do is not, it's not an easy job to run a competition like that, especially, when they're relying so heavily on all of these drivers to come out of pocket to pay, to show up and race their multi-$100,000 race cars every weekend.
Oh yeah,
It's
yeah,
that's a lot. That's a lot going on.
yeah, and despite all the rules to keep them similar, like I don't know any other race series where you can go watch like a turbo 4 making 1,000 horsepower go up against a twin turbo V10 versus the field is very interesting.
Yeah, not as interesting as I would like to see. Like when you say like engine combinations, sure, there are some like outliers like the Papadakis cars that are still four cylinder. Some of them, but most of them are just supercharged or turbocharged V8s. Um, and like I was saying, the chassis are all, yeah, they're different cars, but they're all pretty much the same, 110-inch wheelbase car, with a 295 back tire, 275 front tire, and they weigh 3,000 pounds. So from like a technical standpoint, all the cars are pretty much the same car. But I guess there is some diversity in like the brands and things like that. Not this is basically how NASCAR turned into NASCAR, right? Where like every car is the same car, but they just got like a Camry sticker on the back instead of a Mustang sticker. That
Oh man, I
that's
never really
basically
thought
where it's
about that.
going.
Yeah, I never really thought
Yeah.
about that, but that's a really unfortunately true comparison. So I guess as a former Formula Drift racer, what would you want to see in the sport? Like what cars would make you excited about current FD?
I think that they've gone too far into that direction to go back. So the only way that they would make it like more exciting would be creating a different series. But then again, it's even like a diminishing return on that, because I think that the audience has become a little bit numb to drifting now. Like when drifting started, everybody was really excited to watch it because they'd never seen it before, or there was always that fear of like somebody crashing and, or the excitement of that. But now the drivers are all really good and the cars are really reliable, and there's just not a lot of like extra excitement that people are anticipating. So I think that if you came out with a series where the cars were like different from each other and maybe not as fast and whatnot, I think the audience might not even like that either, because they're so used to seeing the whole like 1,000 horsepower, tons of tire smoke, like current version of drifting. So I don't think that they're doing anything wrong or they should change anything. I think just personally, I enjoy just going more to like grassroots stuff now, just because I can relate to it a little bit more.
That makes sense. Yeah, totally. Well, that kind of wraps up most of the questions. Let's kind of go into shop things. What's new in your shop this week or in the last couple months? I mean, you just finished Black Friday, so I'm sure you're both taking a big sigh of relief and then also nose to the grindstone to get those orders out. What's on your mind as far as shop stuff?
Yeah, I wouldn't say sigh of relief when you sell out of products that you have and you promise customers dates of delivery. It is probably worse than the stress of restocking when you're out of something and you don't have those orders. So right now we're just frantically restocking to just fulfill orders, and we've shipped probably about, I want to say, 85 to 90% of all of the Black Friday orders, but we still have, I don't know, another 80 hours of machine time left before we can get all the last orders out. So we'll probably be all caught up the beginning of next week, I think, and then we'll take that sigh of relief and start working on restocking again.
Awesome. So I guess what's currently on your mills is everything running smoothly? Are you having to reprogram anything? New tooling choices to try to speed things up? Like what's going on in JSP?
Yeah, I I I think one fun part about manufacturing, especially when you're doing it in batches that aren't gigantic, is that you can definitely take what you learn each time you do a batch of parts and then go back and improve upon it. So I do really like that. I do like taking a part that say takes 35 minutes to make on the first run, and then you find all of the areas you can speed it up, and you go back and it's like 17 minutes the second time. That stuff's like kind of rewarding and fun to do. So I try to do that as much as possible. Also, working on surface finishes or details or going and hitting that edge that you didn't program a chamfer on, actually going back and programming a nice break edge on something, things like that. That that's the stuff that I like to do more so than the like actually just loading parts and running them.
Totally. So, are there any new tool path strategies you've tried this week, or any new tool choices you've made to try to improve surface finishes?
Um, Man, the last couple of weeks, like I said, we're just restocking stuff. One thing that I've been really trying to push is my radial step over on my like high speed machining. Um, so like on Mastercam, it would be like a dynamic,
Hmm.
toolpath. So I've always been pretty gentle on like the radial step over when I'm doing like a full depth of cut on an end mill, and I've been starting to push that to see how much I can go, and I haven't broken a single tool yet. um, and so that's pretty exciting to watch when you go from like a 20% step over on a half-inch end mill to a 40% step over, and then you start pumping the feed rate up higher and higher and higher, and it's just like the chips just start flying off higher and higher and higher, but nothing else happens except for the cycle time goes down. That's something I've been experimenting with a lot.
What's your go-to roughing and mill?
Uh, I'm probably a little bit weird in this, but I don't use any roughing end mills. I use my, I basically, I have a sort of a standardized tool list in each one of my, well, not totally, but when I program, I have a standardized tool list that I use, and none of it is roughing and finishing. Everything is just finishing tools. And then as the finishing tools wear, I just replace them. Um, and I almost all of my aluminum cutting tools are the YG1 end mills,
Okay.
and they have even for roughing the high helix angle, or I don't know if it's a low helix angle, but the high rake on the angle is really great for evacuating chips, even in like a roughing scenario. And then they are fine going back and doing finishing passes even right after that.
Wow. Okay, that's awesome. I've heard really, really good things about the YG1 Endles. I've used one or two, because you can get them on Amazon. So like there was that, a few times where it's like, oh man, I needed this length of cut and I don't have time to get it, and then it shows up the next day. But I need to try them out more. I've been thinking about doing a head to head of quite a few manufacturers and just doing a simple like circle square kind of program and testing them all out.
Yeah, my only gripe is that ordering their Power end mills with any type of a corner radius on them is not that easy. And the corners, obviously, when you're doing a lot of roughing, the first thing that's going to go is that sharp corner on the bottom of the end mill. So it would be nice to buy one that has like I don't know, a 30 thou radius or something like that, just to sort of get a little bit more life out of the tool.
Oh yeah,
But
yeah, totally.
that's usually the reason that they get replaced before they break or even have any signs of streaking or chipping on the sides of the flutes.
Oh yeah. I have seen that, and that's one reason actually I started incorporating a roughing ML, because I was definitely worried about that from the process reliability standpoint.
Hmm. Yeah, but I mean, for me, when I'm cutting aluminum parts, the wear on an end mill is so easy to detect, and they tend to last so incredibly long for how much they cost. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah,
That it's almost not worth it for me to like go in and add a roughing tool into programs that are already existing, or even when I'm programming new stuff, it's just so easy to use the same tool to do everything.
yeah. So do you have a 12K spindle in the VF2?
Yeah, the VF2 is just their standard VF2 SS, so 12K spindle, 30 plus one tool changer. Um, it's got the fast rapids, like high speed machining, the HRT 160, and the probing. Um, I think that's about all I got on it.
Okay.
Oh, and
Do you use any
uh,
in process probing for any of your parts?
I mean, because I'm using an old version of Mastercam, it doesn't have any probing in the Mastercam version that I have. So I'm not doing any in-process probing, no.
Okay.
But honestly, like one of the cool things about manufacturing your own products is that you can create your own tolerances, right? So when I'm doing job shop work, yeah, I'm constantly like first article before the part comes out, I'm using gauge pins, I'm inspecting bores, I'm measuring, widths and lengths with micrometers and things like that. But when I'm making my own products, a lot of it is just first one comes out, measure it, make a change if I have to, or because I want to be, more of a high volume production, I try to design all of my products with a built-in tolerance that's not something that I have to stress over, you know.
Yeah, that totally makes
So
sense.
pretty much the only things that I stress are like when I have multiple components that are bolting together. I just, I'll put like a reamed hole and a dowel pin on one side and a reamed hole on the other side, and that sort of just makes sure that the fit up on everything is really nice, and then I don't have to worry about like edges butting together or fitment of parts super critical. I try to design all of my components with the least amount of stress of manufacturing them and assembling them as possible.
That totally makes sense. So you had mentioned earlier because of your job shop experience, you've kind of had a crash course in engineering. Do you create internal engineering documents for your parts? Like, do you have drawings? Do you have, things like that?
I don't ever do any technical drawings of my products, but I do keep notes on things that become critical. Like if I have a slip fit on something, then I'll give myself a high on the part that slips in and a low on the part that it goes into type of thing. I'll make notes of that. Um, Even though I have the Miano lathe, I still sometimes outsource some lathe work to a friend of mine, and most of that just has to do with the limited power that we have. Like I was saying, like if I'm running work in the mills, then I can't run the lathe at the same time. So then for those products, I will just sort of draw up a small print that gives some tolerances and dimensions for the guy that makes them for me. But like I said, there's not a lot of parts that I make that like plus or minus 5 isn't totally acceptable on just about every single dimension.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's obviously on purpose.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, like you said, it's your product, so you have the both the right and the ability to do that. So it's I love making my own parts for my own projects because of that same reason. It's like, oh well, this didn't turn out how I wanted, but I can change it and make it this way, or like, oh, next time, like for customer parts, I'll do this and this and this, and then it'll be perfect. So I totally understand.
Yeah, when you do the job shop stuff, it makes you not you makes you know what you don't want to have to do when you're making your own products.
Exactly. So the other question I always ask all of my guests is, what did you research this week?
So I knew you were going to ask that, and specifically, I've been doing more and more research on the Haas DM machines, just trying to pinpoint all the downsides to them because I like the upsides of the smaller machine. But I know like Peyton's machine had some similar issues to like what I have with my mini mill, where he gets tools on like the tool taper, or like the chips pile up and then the door becomes difficult to open and close. Like weird things like that that nobody would tell you on a brochure, you know?
Yeah.
So I've been dissecting that machine, trying to figure out if it's something that is worth purchasing because it's a very similar price to like the VF, but it has some features that I like.
Well, I know he also had issues with chip evacuation just in general. Like he has the little screw auger, and like that would get jammed up, and chips would get jammed up against the backside of the enclosure. So I don't know what you have on your VF2, if you have a conveyor or if you have the same auger, but
Yeah, I just have the same auger, so I've sort of learned to accept that you have to clean out the machine, once a day or whatever. But this goes back to like my Akuma machines. Neither one of my Akumas had a conveyor or an auger of any type, and had to be manually cleaned out.
I
So,
know those feelings as well. That's no
so the auger was amazing when I got it on the VF2.
fun. Well, yeah, that sounds great. The the DM definitely seems like it's got an attractive package. I how many tools are in your standard library though? Will 18 be enough?
Yeah, that's probably a limiting factor. I got, the VF2s now I'll have like a 30 +1, which is cool because all the Akumas I had were 20. And I would say maybe 2 or 3 times I needed more than 20, but very rarely do I need more than 20. So I don't think that the 18 would be a problem. But where it would be a problem is like standardizing the tool index, I think.
Yeah, yeah, especially if you've got 30 right now, that could be, especially if you get probing with the DM too, because then you're already down a tool as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was excited to get the Pro in me because everybody talks so highly about it. But maybe because I'm not doing any in-process inspection with it, I I get it. Like for part setting and things like that, it's cool. But if for what I've been using it for, it hasn't been like life changing compared to using like dial indicators and edge finders. And I don't know if that's just because like I learned on dial indicators and edge finders, but maybe when I move into a different software that I can do like in process probing and things like that, I'll see the benefit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I use it all the time just for even second ops. Like instead of using work stops, I just use a ruler to set parts in the vise, and it just makes that much easier.
Yeah, because Stacy does a lot of running of the machines, I find it um, really easy to set up the parts, with a part stop to put the part up against, instead of just sort of like a visual location.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing though that you could definitely use for her benefit too. Is you could use the probe as kind of a safety check. Like I use it
Hmm.
at work a lot. I'll plunge it, in a safe move into a hole that's supposed to be in a part in a certain location on a fixture, and if it's not there, or sorry, if the hole's not there and it hits material before it's supposed to, then it errors out and it says, you loaded the part wrong, that kind of thing.
Mm.
Or you can even probe stock values if you've got like a 4.5 or a 5 inch block by 3 inches. If it picks up the 5 inches in the wrong axis, it'll error out and say you loaded it wrong, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I could see that being beneficial, especially some of the parts that I make, like the stock size isn't much larger than the finish size on some of the dimensions. And there can be some variation in sawing or even with the way that she loads it. So I guess it would be pretty cool to have the probe go in and even reset the work offset based on the stock size.
I just had to do that last night. I had a 4 inch part in a 4 inch 030 block and cleaned up on every side and had no problem.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but
So here's a question I got for you.
yeah,
I
shoot.
see a lot of people online when they're programming their part based on their stock and they're putting their work origin. There seems to be like a pretty heavy divide between people that are using a corner and people that are using a center line.
Hmm.
Do you see any benefit to programming off of the corner of a piece of material instead of center line on the material size?
First ops, I very often program on a corner, unless I know the stock varies drastically. But if I know all my stocks within, I don't know, 10 or 20 thou, I just program off the corner because it's easier to pick up. Uh, but then on second ops, I very often do a center line because, especially since I'm probing, it accounts for any error if I do it off the center line, if that makes sense. So, like, if the part's 4 thou bigger, it's 4 thou bigger everywhere, and that center is still in the center of the part.
So do you have a different origin for your first op and second op? Then you don't maintain the same position.
Oh, I almost always have a different one because I have different jaws and all that stuff too for it.
See that's one benefit I see from programming off the center line on X and Y on the part, is that it's not a physical position that you aren't able to pick up on the second side. Like obviously you're saying if you pick up on the corner of the stock, then that position is removed in the first operation. But if you have a theoretical center of the stock, that position is still theoretically on center when you go to op two. So when you're programming it, your origin maintains the same position throughout every operation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I that totally makes sense. That's why I pick up in the center often on op two because the center's the center. But in that case, I don't really care where op one was anyway, or op 10, or however you want to refer to it.
So does Fusion have any issues when you're doing? You're still using Fusion, right?
Hmm.
So does there any issues with having multiple origins when you're doing simulation?
No, you just highlight all the ops you want to simulate, and it goes.
Oh, because like in Mastercam, when you're running through your simulation, if your origin position changes, you have to like update your stock position for the different You basically have to tell it when things are moving around, and it becomes sort of a hassle. But if you keep your origin in the same position and you run the simulation, it just always knows where that is, if that makes sense.
So are you going through the WCS manager and creating multiple WCSs for the different ops?
I only create new I only create new WCSs if they're not the standard, top, left, front, back, right, whatever. Um,
Okay.
so, and going back to me always making my own parts in a way that is easy to make, I very rarely try to create any features that are not either parallel or perpendicular to some other feature, if that makes sense. So the only times that I do have to create my own work instruction planes are in those strange cases when I'm not able to do that. Um, and then, yeah, I guess then I go back in and readjust the origin on that new work instruction plane to match the center line on the old one.
Oh, okay. It's I'm pulling on years and years ago of Mastercam to try to think through how I used to program in it. Um, but yeah, no, I think that if what you're doing works, then that's all that really matters. But um, like I said, like the part last night, because I knew that my stock size was so close to my part size, I programmed off center line for both ops because I wanted to make sure that it picked up the center both times and was dead nuts perfect. But yeah, I don't know. I think again, different strokes for different folks, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've definitely learned in the trade that there's a million different ways to do everything. And when I was working at that job shop originally, he was a very sort of like old school machinist where like every single tool path was a 2D tool path. Every single thing had like a rough, a finish, and a spring pass. Everything was super redundant and slow. And so when I started programming, I was just mimicking all of the stuff that I had witnessed. And then, years later, now I'm just like, oh God, like every single thing that I programmed 3 or 4 years ago is about 5 times longer than it should be.
Yeah,
So,
isn't that lovely when you go back and you're like, man, what idiot programmed this? And you're like, oh, it was
oh,
me. That's right.
yeah, it's always me when I say, oh, what idiot did this?
Oh man.
So I wanted to ask you, did your compressor come today?
No, it's supposed to come tomorrow. According to the tracking, it is in Phoenix, and it's supposed to be delivered tomorrow morning. So fingers crossed it actually shows up. We have somebody already waiting to pick up our old compressor. He came by Sunday and looked at it and gave us a down payment on it. Was like, I'm very serious. Pull it off Craigslist. I want this. And I was like, oh, cool. Okay. So he texted me today. I was like, hey, when can I come pick it up? I'm like, as soon as we get the other one.
Yeah.
So fingers crossed it's here tomorrow, and then he can come Friday and pick up our old one, and then we can get it hooked up then.
Yeah, that screw compressor is like one of those game changer things in the shop. Like they're not silent, but it's just like you don't have that pounding headache from being next to those piston compressors at the end of the day.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I mean, it might not be silent, but it's probably a half or a third as loud as the piston compressor too. I mean, it's got that
Yeah,
whine, but it's still heaps
yeah,
better.
it's more of like a white noise, like a background noise, where like the piston compressor noise is like a front and center like pounding noise all day long.
Yeah. Yeah. They said in some video about our piston compressor, like, oh yeah, it's quiet enough you can have a conversation next to it, or like a phone. And it's like, yeah, if you're screaming at the person next to you, sure. I can also have a conversation on an airplane during takeoff, but it's not comfortable. Like it's so I'm very ready to, be able to listen to music in the shop and not have to not hear half of it anymore and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, before I bought my screw compressor, I had built like a plywood enclosure completely around my piston compressor to try to quiet it down. And that basically heat soaked it, and I ended up killing a bunch of compressors because it was so hot in the box. But I was almost willing to replace compressors rather than listen to the noise of the not muffled one.
And you have a Kaiser, is that right? Or
Not, I got a Quincy 7.5 horsepower.
right. How do you like it?
I like everything about it except that when I bought it, um, it was in a pinch because our piston compressor had died again, and I needed something. Um, and the only thing they had in the showroom was a single phase compressor. And I asked the guy, I said, hey, what's the difference between the single phase and the three phase? And he's like, oh, it's pretty much the same thing. It's not a big deal at all. And then me not thinking about it, I was like, okay, fine. But now the air compressor being only on two legs of power instead of three pulls as much power as one of the CNC machines does. And hence why we can only run two CNC machines at a time.
Yeah. We went three phase with our piston compressor for that exact reason. We knew we only had 100 amps, and we were like, oh well, anything we can do to lower that load is definitely what we're going to do.
And another thing for guys that are moving into small shops with not a lot of power, uh, things like on the VF2, I was under the impression that all of the power would be drawing would be mostly on like spindle acceleration, and like cutting loads and things like that. But when I had an electrician here measuring, I wanted to see how much, what was pulling what so that I could be careful when I'm running everything. And it was actually the Z axis braking. So as the Z column is coming down to the table and goes to brake, is the highest load that the machine sees under all of the other loads that the machine sees.
Wow.
So since new, I have never run that machine at 100% rapid because, well, not since new, but right after new, I ran it at 100% rapid and blew a fuse because it was braking on the Z axis. And now, since then, I only run at 50% rapid. So, something to think about, like if you're running a shop that doesn't have a lot of power, maybe buying that machine that has like a high rapid speed isn't, you're not going to be able to benefit from it.
Huh, that's really interesting. Yeah, never would have guessed that. I definitely would have assumed it was, axis acceleration or spindle acceleration or deceleration, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, just every other part of like I think the machine says that it can pull like 60 amps or 70 amps or something, which is a gross exaggeration. It's usually averaging like 12 to 18 or something while it's operating. But when it hits that spike on that 100% rapid on the Z straight down and then stalls, it spikes to like 55 or something, 60 amps just
Oh,
for a
wow.
second.
That's
Yeah,
crazy.
it's like a huge spike.
Wow. That is insane. Uh, well, cool. I don't want to take up any more of your time. I know you got to get back to Black Friday fulfillment. So thank you again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Anytime.
Awesome. Well, guys, we will see you next week. And thanks again, John.
No problem. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later.